So in the afternoon session, we are now going to go into the more legal elements. This morning, there were quite a number of references that were made, first of all, by Radwan as well as Betty, who talked about the transitional justice and also gave some background on what the human rights work that has been ongoing in terms of monitoring and documentation that has been ongoing in Sudan and is currently ongoing, what that entails. But Radwan also made a very interesting point, which I want us to then, think about. He talked about some of the work that has been done in terms of how do we move to the next step of accountability. So there's all this documentation and monitoring that's ongoing, but then how do we take this to the next step? And Khulud also mentioned when she was speaking, she talked about how when the guns are going off, the law is silent. Or was that you, Michael? I think it was Michael. Yeah, so, the law tends to be silent. And this is something that we're going to be addressing in this session, looking at what are the legal responses that we can have to what is currently happening in Sudan. So this session is going to look at the ICC. What has it been doing in Sudan? As we know, since 2005, the UN Security Council referred the situation in Darfur to the International Criminal Court, which began its investigations and decided to indict a number of individuals for crimes which they considered that these people had committed in the territory of Darfur. And since then, there's also been a lot of work that has been ongoing in terms of with the victim communities in Darfur. We heard from a participant this morning who talked about the frustration when a victim is approached multiple times to talk about the violations that have been committed against them. And yet again, more violations happen. And what is then the response? So these are some of the things that we'll also address in this session. But to begin with, when we have serious human rights violations that are being committed, what are these violations called? Are they crimes against humanity? Are they war crimes? Are they even international crimes to begin with? And this is something that Philip is going to take us through, how to classify international crimes and how to name these crimes, to know what crime we are dealing with. We've had people saying right now in Darfur, there is crimes against humanity that is being committed. Is that actually the case? Other people have even mentioned genocide. Is that actually the case? So this is something that Michael is also going to talk about as he begins. He's also going to talk about the very recent developments that we have from the court. Just last week, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court gave his half-yearly report to the Security Council, where he talked about what the ICC intends to do in the situation in Sudan. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Michael to talk about this, and then thereafter, we're going to hear from Philip about the role of the ICC.
Good afternoon. I have you when you're fresh, just after eating, a bit tired and drowsy. It's the perfect time to talk about the International Criminal Court. The prosecutor's comments just a few days ago to the Security Council, they're actually quite a departure from my experience at the International Criminal Court and from me monitoring the situation in Darfur. And I'm going to tell you exactly why. When I was working at the ICC in the Darfur situation, it was the first time in 11 years working at the court where the Office of the Prosecutor was actually very clear about the limitations of the office's engagement in the country. They were saying very clearly, we have these arrest warrants that are outstanding. We are devoting all of our investigation resources on shoring up those investigations. We are not looking at anything else. It was great, actually, because when the Office of the Prosecutor is clear about its limited scope, it enables the rest of the country that it's operating in to get on with the business they need to get on with, which is accountability for the rest of the country, right? The prosecutor's mandate, as given by the Security Council, is limited to Darfur. That's clear, right? That means that if crimes are committed in Khartoum, the ICC does not have jurisdiction. Is that clear? Did you know that? Blue Nile, South Kordofan, all outside ICC jurisdiction. The ICC cannot investigate allegations of criminal activity there. So it's not that it has a Sudan-wide mandate. It is focused principally on Darfur. Now, why are these comments, the statement from the ICC prosecutor to the Security Council, relevant? Well, the prosecutor confirmed that they are now investigating contemporary crimes being committed in Darfur. That is a big, big departure from even 2021 October when I was working there. They were not doing this then. There were crimes being committed, and I don't have to tell you, in Janina in 2019. And the Office of the Prosecutor was not investigating them. But the prosecutor now has confirmed, in his words, that in light of the recent findings from the High Commissioner for Human Rights, that they are investigating those allegations. That is exactly what he said. He also said this, he said, I quote, "I wish to be very clear that our mandate with respect to Security Council Referral 1593 is ongoing." That's a big departure, right? It's not without some legal controversy. Because if you look at that Security Council referral from 2005, it speaks about in the war in Darfur. And lawyers will fight about this. We heard already from Radwan earlier that this conflict should be treated differently than previous conflicts. If it is a different conflict, there will be future defense lawyers who will argue that the ICC does not have jurisdiction. Do you get the distinction? The Security Council made a referral in 2005 about the war in Darfur. Future defense lawyers may say that this war is different than that war, and therefore the ICC does not have jurisdiction. Yeah? The ICC prosecutor also raised the specter of investigations for anyone, whether they be inside the country or outside the country, who aids and abets criminal activity in Darfur would also be under investigation. That also expands the scope. Quite dramatically, actually, if you think about the actors that we have been talking about. So if the RSF is receiving support to commit crimes in Darfur from the Libyans, from others in West Africa, from others in the Arab Peninsula, there is potential that they and their support, their aiding and abetting, could potentially be the subject of an investigation as well. Right? These are big departures. That's big news, actually. Now, at the same time, if any of you have ever heard me speak before, I don't want to leave any of you with lingering expectations with respect to immediate action from the International Criminal Court. Let's be realistic. This is now, we are reverting back to the period that we had faced from 2005 until 2018. The ICC will have absolutely no access to the country of Sudan, to the territory of Sudan. It's not easy to conduct thorough investigations when you can't step foot in the country. It's a huge limitation. There's also the access to suspects. You can see very clearly a situation where, even in the best case scenario, these investigations result in arrest warrants. We can have a situation where we have uneffectuated arrest warrants for another 10 years. That's also a possibility. Look what happened in Ukraine, right? The ICC was very fast in issuing arrest warrants in that conflict against the head of state. Has that conflict stopped? Is the artillery still aimed at each other? Are the belligerents still fighting in Russia and Ukraine? The ICC is not necessarily a mechanism that will result in the cessation of hostilities, right? It is just a part of the solution when it comes to accountability. But if we all put our hands up and say, wow, well, the ICC is on this, I guess there's nothing further for us to do, believe me, nothing will be done with respect to impunity. It's your responsibility, the people in this room, to take up the mantle, especially now, if the ICC or any justice accountability mechanism has any hope for succeeding. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. I am greatly indebted to Michael for this part, because I cannot speak for the Office of the Prosecutor, because I'm part of the ICC registry, and to speak on behalf of the prosecutor would make me lose my job rather quickly. Therefore, quick disclaimer at the beginning: I do not speak on behalf of the ICC, but as sort of, if you want, an international criminal law scholar in the first place. And my task is, in the first place, to also tell you a little bit what I think, how what we've heard this morning can translate into Rome Statute crimes, into crimes under international law, as they would be prosecuted at the ICC. A quick word on the expose, which is, I think, very much on point, that Michael just gave, sort of on a very private capacity. I am very happy to see that change that Michael underlined in the prosecutor's policy towards Sudan, for the simple reason that we've seen, I think, a drastic ramp up of potential criminality that happens since April 15, and the fact that the prosecutor quickly reacted to that is in itself, I think, a good sign and an important move forward. And one thing to underline, which I think we should be aware of: the prosecutor made it clear that indeed crimes only committed in Sudan are within his mandate as per the 2015 Security Council resolution. But anybody supporting these crimes from anywhere else could be thereby also part of the targeted individuals by an ICC investigation. Michael mentioned this in terms of aiders and abettors. But I'd like to expand this to anybody who is responsible for these crimes, maybe as the mastermind, maybe as the one that ordered these crimes, or maybe also as the one that failed to prevent these crimes. The so-called superior responsibility. Just be mindful of the fact that we have this vehicle under international criminal law, that we attach the greatest leaders to the crimes committed on the ground through the relevant modes of liability. And that's, I think, part of what the the specifics of international crimes are about. We're not just looking at the killing on the ground. We're looking at whether somebody higher up is orchestrating this, whether there is a policy behind it. And we will get to this. Now, quickly to the crimes. The title of the lesson speaks about the chapeau elements. Now, that sounds rather bizarre. Chapeau is French for a hat. Basically, what we mean with this is the specifics of international crimes. You have to imagine that the 4 core crimes, as we know them in the Rome Statute, by the way, it's 4, it's not 3, 4. Crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, and the crime of aggression. These 4 crimes have a certain build, and that means that they are, if you want, two-pronged. They have the relevant crimes committed on the ground: murder, torture, forcible displacement. And then there is the so-called chapeau element, the element that makes them so grave, that makes them an international crime. For war crimes, this is that they are committed as part of and in connection to an armed conflict. And I'm not going to get into the details of that, just so you see what that means. A war crime is an underlying act, a killing, an attack on the civilian population, torture, sexual crimes that are committed during an armed conflict. Armed conflict means war, during war. Now, where does this crime come from? This crime comes from the simple realization that during war, certain persons have to be protected and certain conduct has to be prohibited. Not every means of warfare is allowed. The Geneva Conventions that you all know protect certain groups of persons. Now that protection is reflected in the war crime provision. The killing of a humanitarian aid worker is a war crime. The killing of a civilian is a war crime. The killing of a soldier hors combat, which means that has laid down his or her weapons or is unable to fight, is a war crime. Now all that resonates with things that we've heard this morning, right? All these incidents have been reported this morning. The specificity in the conflict in Sudan is that we're looking at a conflict that is not of an international nature, a so-called non-international armed conflict. The reason why I'm mentioning it is initially, in the early 20th century, states that ratified relevant conventions were focusing on international wars, because that is what was the normality back then. But if you look at what happened in the past 80 years, you look at conflicts that are mostly internal, or not between states, but between non-state actors, or states and non-state actors. In the Sudanese context, you can speak of the Sudanese armed forces versus the response forces. And here you would have a state actor, state army, versus a paramilitary force, rather a non-state actor. Think about the Arab militia that we also heard about this morning. Maybe these groups are also separate groups that have a role in this armed conflict. This is important because if you open the war crimes provision in the Rome Statute, we're now fast forwarding to the courtroom. if I want to prosecute crimes, I need to specify whether they have been committed in international or non-international armed conflict, because the norms are slightly different. In broad terms, non-international armed conflict has a little less protective shield for victims than international armed conflict. Another important thing to mention is that, in particular in non-international armed conflict, you have to reach a certain threshold of intensity. It is called protracted armed violence by organized groups. This is why it is important, what we heard this morning, that as of 15 April, we have a very high ramp up of intensity of incidents. Not a single day has passed that not an incident has happened which was mentioned today. A killing, an attack against the civilian population, sexual violence, pillage, and so on. That is important for us to be able to determine that indeed we have a non-international armed conflict. It is not just sporadic violence, which wouldn't yet make it to the threshold of activating the war crime provision. And finally, we have to have a so-called nexus between the armed conflict and the crimes. So for instance, if I commit a theft of a car of my neighbor, and there happens to be an armed conflict happening, this doesn't make it a war crime. It still is a regular theft. But if I run into the World Food Programme's office, I loot the office and I take away their car, then it becomes potentially a war crime, because I'm looting the office of an institution that was linked to the humanitarian help in this conflict situation. And again, I'm not giving you a hypothetical example, but something that I've heard has happened. And here again, we are therefore looking at potentially a war crime. Just to give you a quick idea on what we're looking at from what I've heard. Killings of civilians, definitely a war crime. Extrajudiciary executions, that is executions of individuals without there being a proper trial. This is something that I took from the prosecutor's own words. He says that he is investigating extrajudicial killings. Attacks against the civilian population, we've heard about that this morning. This may be any random shooting at the civilian population, any physical or bodily harm that is intended at a group. It is actually a very powerful provision where, as a prosecutor, you can actually find a lot of conduct that is targeting the civilian population in that provision. Attack against buildings dedicated to education, schools, hospitals, we've heard it. These are war crimes. Schools and hospitals and other buildings that are dedicated to means of, if you want, functioning society and infrastructure are protected at all times, unless and until they're being abused and turned into military facilities and thereby military targets. Think of a group that actually enters a hospital knowing that the hospital cannot be targeted and makes it its command central. The hospital does not contain any sick people anymore. Thereby it becomes a military target. The real problem is, though, if you have militants hiding in a hospital. The hospital business continues, and you just have some militants in that target. This is a big problem because the protection remains. However, the belligerent factions may still see that there is an overarching military gain in shelling that facility, and then you obviously have massive casualties. This is just an example. I do not have any proof for that specific incident having happened since 15 April. We've heard about pillaging at a pretty industrial scale, which is also a war crime. Rape, sexual slavery. When I say sexual slavery, I'm referring in particular to something I've heard, that women are being first taken into captivity and then sold on markets. And we're going to get to the crimes against humanity in a second, and you will see that there is a massive overlap. And then we have the destruction and seizure of property, destruction of marketplaces, and seizure of property of private persons and others. That was only war crimes. I've just given you a couple of war crimes that, from the information that I've heard, I would, if I was an investigator, look into retrieving the facts. A quick word on one of the topics that I'm supposed to be talking to, the technical aspects of litigating. Think about the necessity for me as an investigator to now find evidence for all these incidents that we've heard about. I have to find proof for all these incidents, and at the same time, I also have to find proof for the armed conflict, the belligerent activities, the identity of the perpetrators. Because if I want to impute certain crimes on a specific group, I need to know that this group has actually perpetrated the crimes, so I need proof for that. I now quickly move to crimes against humanity. The specificity of crimes against humanity is that it is not linked to an armed conflict. You can commit a crime against humanity in peacetime. Crime against humanity has the same general concept of two different layers that I mentioned earlier on. You have the crime on the ground, killing, enslavement, forcible transfer, persecution. And here comes the chapeau. It has to be committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population. So what you have here is the perpetrator as part of an attack that is destined at the civilian population, not at the military, commits certain singular crimes within that general framework of the attack. What is so powerful about this crime is that it manages to capture state violence before anybody can respond to the state violence, for instance, through armed resistance. Think about the first revolutionary steps in Libya, where the Libyan leadership tried to quell peaceful protesters by just shooting live ammunition into the crowds. That's a fantastic example where you're not yet in war crimes territory. You cannot yet prosecute somebody for doing this, despite it being heavily controlled, heavily organized, state violence happening in a widespread and systematic fashion. That's the benefit of crimes against humanity. And here, we would have to look whether this also applies in the Sudanese context. Do we have a widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population? And I think that, from what I heard, I have very little doubt. One question I asked to the previous panel was whether the speaker from Amnesty International would be able to say whether there is some sort of policy element that he sees behind the RPF attacks in Darfur. And he said that he sees that there is a communication between the paramilitary forces and Arab militia. That's an interesting fact to hear, that there's communication, sort of a conceptual thinking. But what was just as important to hear was that there was similar kinds of attacks in different towns. That's a clear indicator for there being some sort of a pattern behind it, that there's organization behind it, and that these are not coincidental criminal acts by small groups, which, however, don't make it yet to a organizational policy that stands behind this crime. So I would say, for the investigator, it will be very important to look into the question whether the crimes that have been committed can be led to higher echelons where certain policy decisions were taken in terms of how attacks against civilians are being performed. Yeah. Quickly to the crimes that are encompassed by this. Murder. By the way, the same murder that I can already qualify as a war crime. So this is where you have an overlap, and that is permissive under international criminal law. Enslavement. We talked about the trafficking of women. Forcible transfer, deportation. We talked about refugee or persons being pushed out of Darfur into Chad and being killed on the way. Rape, sexual slavery, again, a crime that goes across war crimes and crimes against humanity. And I also heard of many cases of enforced disappearance, in particular in the early days of the war, that a lot of persons were detained or otherwise simply disappeared and nobody knows where they are. A last word on genocide, and that's interesting. Genocide are acts that are destined at eradicating an entire group. These acts can be killing, these acts can be birth control, these acts can be separation of men and women and relocation. We have many examples in history of how you can destroy an ethnic, religious, national or racial group. Being German, I can tell you we have our history in doing that quite industrially. Now, we've heard individuals use the word genocide. What I would be looking at as an investigator is whether there has been an intention, in particular when it comes to the killing of the Masalit men and boys. Was this with an intention to destroy that group? And you remember my question I asked whether, again, the poor speaker of Amnesty International, whether he can tell me or us that the Masalit men and boys were targeted for being Masalit. And the difference is very important. If they were targeted for being occupying my land, I want to either just push them out or neutralize them so that I can have the land. That is not genocidal intent. Genocidal intent is, I want to eradicate all Masalit living in Darfur. And again, here you're looking at a very difficult point to prove, because hardly anybody will be volunteering that he or she had genocidal intent, apart from the Nazis. So that was just my rundown for the crimes. Now some words on the whole item of victim participation. Because I think the work that many of you are doing is directly linking and relating to victims. And at the same time, so far we've only been speaking about finding proof for crimes, how to come to justice and put the perpetrators behind bars. Early attempts of international criminal justice, of bringing perpetrators to international courts, have not included the possibility for victims to participate in these proceedings. The reasons may be that they wanted to try out the revolutionary model in the easiest fashion first. One thing, however, is certain, in particular with the UN tribunals, the UN ad hoc tribunals for the Rwandan genocide in 1994 and for the Yugoslavia war in 1993, clearly demonstrated that one of the biggest gaps these tribunals had were that they did not address the victim's plight for being able to connect to these justice mechanisms. You're looking at mass criminality, mass crimes. The specificity of these crimes is that victims are in the thousands. Now, if you exclude these same stakeholders from the justice process, you have to ask yourself the question, whom are we doing this justice process for? And the ICC, I think, is a proponent of trying to find a solution, because it does provide for victims to be able to participate in proceedings and to claim reparations if there is a conviction. I just want to leave you with one thought, and that is, transpose this to any and all efforts that we are trying to make in the Sudanese context. That may be the renewed investigation by the prosecutor, potential new cases at the ICC, but importantly, national solutions. National solutions, or even an internationalized solution, as foreseen by the Juba Peace Accord, needs to cater for the possibility for victims to attach to these justice institutions. They need to be able to partake in this, not just as witnesses, but as victims submitting their views and concerns. And as a final thought, reparations. We have to ask ourselves, how do we do this? I think everybody would agree that, yes, we want victims to get reparations for their suffering. We had this pointed question this morning to one of the panelists. But be careful, because reparations are a very, very difficult field for one single reason. Where does the money come from? The ICC has a trust fund. The ICC is a permanent institution. It has 123 states parties, amongst them all the rich European nations. Yet that trust fund has one massive problem, and that is lack of funds to repair the victims of harm of ICC proceedings. Translate that into the context of a single state armed conflict. where will monies or any other means come from in order to afford reparations to the affected population? This requires more than just pointing at a potentially heavily strained state structure, if it is still at all existing. And you have to think much more globally. You have to think regional, you may have to think even international, and look at the current realities. Many countries are competing in terms of conflict and in terms of international crimes being committed and victims being entitled to reparations. So here we need to think hard how this concept can work before we institutionalize a vehicle which then, however, remains completely empty for the victims when they read, oh, I can get reparations at the end of a process, and nobody knows where the money will come from. I leave it there.
Injuste. I don't speak French, but it sounds interesting. So thank you to both Michael and Philip for their very, very interesting interventions. I think they've given us all a lot to think about and a lot to, to process. Now I'd like to open up to questions from the participants. So please, say your name and say who the question is for.
السلام عليكم. اسمي فيصل الباقر، صحفي ومدافع في حركة حقوق الإنسان. أنا من صحفيون لحقوق الإنسان جهر السودان. سؤالي
just wait one moment. Let's get them hooked up so that they can hear the question.
It's working. Yes.
السلام عليكم. اسمي فيصل الباقر، صحفي ومدافع في حركة حقوق الإنسان السودانية، من صحفيون لحقوق الإنسان جهر. سؤالي: ما هو تصنيف الجرائم المرتكبة ضد الصحفيين والصحفيات والمؤسسات الصحفية والإعلامية؟ ما هي حدود الحماية التي يجب أن توفر للصحفيين والصحفيات وهم يؤدون مهامهم في تغطية النزاع المسلح؟ ما هي حدود الحماية التي يجب أن يوفرها الأطراف المتحاربة أو المتقاتلة؟ هل لكم أن تحدثوننا عن الالتزامات والحماية المطلوبة التي يوفرها القانون الدولي الإنساني للصحفيين والصحفيات وهم يمارسون مهامهم في تغطية النزاعات؟ شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, El-Bashir.
Good afternoon. El-Bashir Idris, independent freelance. My question is on regarding child soldiers. And how would you be able to discern child soldiers? Is this from paperwork? Is this from physical appearance? We've seen child soldiers on the media, especially with the RSF, Rapid Support Forces. And would child soldiers fall under your section or the section of victims' participation and reparations in that sense? And would that further lead to commander responsibility and implications of that? Thank you.
السيد مايكل قال التفويض بتاع المحكمة الجنائية محصور في دارفور حسب القرار في 2005. إذا رأت المدعي العام للمحكمة الجنائية هناك جرائم أو إشارات أولية لجرائم إبادة جماعية أو جرائم ضد الإنسانية خارج دارفور، التفويض ما في تفويض بديه أنه يفتح تحقيق منه بطلب من مكتب المدعي يعني مثلا الحالة بتاعت يوغندا، يعني برضو يوغندا ما نزاع، يوغندا نزاع بتاع متمردين والحكومة، الجرائم ارتكبت في جيش الرب جوزيف كوني، انه ممكن الحاجة دي تبقى برضو.
Crimes concerning Sudanese in neighboring countries?
Yeah.
Sorry, just so I'm clear, are you talking about crimes concerning Sudanese in neighboring countries, or just any crimes committed in other countries? Like the example you gave in Uganda is a completely different conflict involving different victims.
نو انا سؤالي انه يعني نفس الخطوات والتجربه اللي قام بها المحكمه الجنائيه في يوغندا ممكن تكون نموذج، لانه مكتب المدعي يقوم بنفس الاجراءات دي في السودان لكن خارج منطقه دارفور.
I think I got it.
You got it. Okay, good.
Okay. Hello.
Yeah. And wait, Hafiz. He had the question.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Hatim Badin. I work for USIP, United States Institute of Peace, country representative for Sudan. My question is also related to the mandate. As Michael mentioned, that the ICC prosecutor has already started investigating like current crimes, which may be or easily can be challenged based on the mandate for 2005. So what can be done to mitigate any potential challenge to this? I do understand that it's difficult within, of course, the Security Council with maybe extending or expanding the mandate, but I just want to understand what's the process to potentially expand this mandate to current crimes on Darfur and maybe entire Sudan. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
اوكي. انا عبد المنعم ماديبو. انا صحفي من دارفور في موقع دارفور 24. طيب انا سؤالي كثير ما المحكمة الجنائية تتحدث عن معوقات كانت تواجهها في السنوات الماضية بعد القرار 1593 الخاص بدارفور، في انه ما لاقي تعاون من الجهات السودانية في انها تقوم بالتحقيق المفترض تقوم به. الآن المدعي بيتكلم عن انه حيبدأ تحقيق في الجرائم التي وقعت الآن. هل الطرفان حتى الآن المتقاتلين الجيش والدعم السريع أبدوا أي اعتراض كما كان يحدث في السابق على أداء المحكمة أو التحقيق الذي تنوى المحكمة القيام به؟ هل هناك رفض من الطرفين؟ وهل إذا رفض أحد الطرفين سيكون ذلك معيقا لعمل المحكمة في التحقيق في هذه الجرائم؟ شكرا جزيلا.
طيب شكرا للفرصة. أنا الزهاوي إدريس من الجنينة خرب دارفور. أنا سؤالي بالنسبة للتحقيقات اللي بتعملها المحكمة، ممكن يكون كل الانتهاكات والجرائم ضد الإنسانية اللي بيتكلم عنها مايكل يعني هي حصلت فعليا يعني، لكن في النهاية الناس بتمشي اتجاه الإجراء بتاعت التحقيق ده. فالتحقيق هل بيعتمد على إنه يعني لأنه جزء كبير جدا من الانتهاكات دي هي حصلت لكن ما في برضه في النهاية دوكومنت أو توثيق له بشكل واضح، لكن أنت ممكن تلاقي الضحايا من خلال التحقيق مع الضحايا ممكن يكون في من الضحايا بتعرف إنه فعلا الحاجة دي حصلت. فأنا يعني التحقيق هل فعلا بيعتمد على الضحايا ولا يعني في بروسيس إجراءات تانية، يعني الآليات بتاعت التحقيق شنو؟ لأنه هي حاجات فعلا حصلت.
Just repeat the last sentence.
Slowly, please. You know, the translators are struggling. They need to speak slowly. Yeah? Because I think either English is difficult for them. Okay. So then we don't get your question. Slowly.
بالنسبة للتحقيق يعني الآليات أو الاعتماد بتاع التحقيق بيعتمد على شنو يعني خير لأنه الحاجات ما قاعدة بيتم توثيقها ما في دوكيمنت خير الضحايا يعني مثلا وهي حاجات فعلا حصلت فعشان انت بتجيب حقوق الضحايا في الصعوبة بتاعت التوثيق ده انت مثلا ما
Okay, so I'll just take two questions from Hafiz and Radwan, and then we have to. Okay, you were there before, yeah? Okay, but you've asked so many questions. Yeah. So let me give a chance to the others, and then if we get time, we come to you. Yeah. So let me go to Hafiz.
اوكي السلام عليكم انا حافظ صحفي من السودان. بس انا عندي سؤالين. بالنسبه السؤال المتعلق بالاباده الجماعيه في الكيس بتاع الزالينيا حاليا بتاع جنين او سوري. انا جيت من شركه دشات قبل يومين كنت والتقيت بعدد من الضحايا ووثقت جزء من الجرائم هناك في شركه دشات. انه يعني واحد من الحاجات اللي وثقناها في اماكن محدده بيتم فيها جمع المساليد من مناطق مختلفه وبيتم قتلهم. يعني في محل اسمه حوش البقر عدد من الضحايا قالوا انه بيتم مجموع يعني واحد تكلمنا معاه تم قتل ولده في نفس المنطقه في محل اسمه حوش البقر. تم جمعهم من الاحياء المختلفه جاءوا بقتلهم. جاء حاول انه يمرق ابنه ما قدر لكن عدموا 38 نفر في نفس المكان. وعدد من الضحايا تكلموا عن هذا الحديث. الشيء الثاني يعني المجموعات والميليشيات والدعم القوات الدعم السريع عملوا عدد من البوابات من أدري من جنين إلى أدري بيسألوا الناس عن جنسهم فقط. يعني إذا أنت كنت مصلاتي يتم قتلك بشكل واضح بشكل مباشر. حتى إذا كنت أنت من قبيلة تانية بيطلبوا منك تتحدث باللغة بتاعت القبيلة إذا زغاوة أو فورة أو قبيلة تانية. إذا اتكلمت باللغة بتاعت القبيلة التانية بيخلوك. إذا ما قتلت بيعتبروك مستات ويتم ضربك بشكل مباشر. فأنا بالنسبة لي إنه هل الحاجات دي أو هل الوثائق دي بتأكد إنه دي إبادة جماعية ولا ما بتأكد؟ دي حاجة واحدة. السؤال الثاني الحرب دي يعني بدأت التاريخ بدأ يعيد نفسه. مثلا الآن في طفل اسمه صبري ده هو عمره 11 عام ولد في المعسكر لأنه أمه جات من منطقة اسمها جيكونغ كانت في الحرب ده 2003 تم قتل أمها وأبوها وجات لوحدها وولدت صبري. الآن صبري ده تم قتل أمه وأبوه في الجنينة وهو الآن في أدري. يعني نفس الحلقة دارت. وعدد من الأطفال الآن موجودين في معسكر تشاد يعني نفس الحلقة بتاع التاريخ عادت مرة أخرى. الآن لو مشيت لمنطقة معسكر اسمه فرشنة معسكر قاقا كانت فيها 500,000 لاجئ تقريبا. حاليا بدأت معسكرات جديدة تنمو في نفس المكان بأعداد كبيرة جدا هل يكون الآن وصلت إلى 100,000. فهل هذا الحديث هل يعني هذه الجرائم ممكن تحرك المحكمة الجنائية الدولية تتخذ خطوات بديلة أو إجراءات سريعة؟ لأنه الآن الناس برضو جزء من المقابلة أنا عملتها مع واحد من اللاجئين من الضحايا لما سألته عن المسؤولية والمحكمة الجنائية الدولية رفض يتحدث معي ووقف المقابلة على الإطلاق وزعل من الموضوع لأنهم فقدوا الأمل بشكل واضح.
Radwan.
No. Just very quick question. It's addressed to Philippe and Michael both. If they don't see in the recent presentation of the prosecutor to the Security Council and in view of the geopolitical division which is prevailing now in the Council, it is not a way to force them to consider a new resolution, either recovering Darfur or for the whole of Sudan. From a political angle, you who are conversant with what is happening inside the court. Thank you.
Okay, who will go first? Okay.
This, where, however, one has to consider the ICC is one tiny little court that depends entirely on the cooperation of states. If that cooperation is not forthcoming, we don't get accused in the docks, we cannot render proceedings. Why have there not been proceedings against the other 3, 4, 5 accused, potential accused in Sudan? Because we've never been able to get hold of them. Over to Michael.
Okay, I'll be quick. To the extent I understood the question, it seemed to me to be a question about how the ICC exercises jurisdiction in general. And so in Sudan, there's one particular way where the ICC exercises jurisdiction, and that's through a Security Council referral. You mentioned Uganda. Okay, I have time then? I got time? I can relax? All right. So, in the context of Uganda, as you also mentioned, Uganda has signed the Rome Statute and ratified it, right? So the ICC has jurisdiction in the territory of Uganda. And in the case of Uganda, in the case of Joseph Kony, Ugandans referred the case to the ICC. Yeah? So they said, ICC, we want you to come. And now you have jurisdiction. Kenya, neighboring country, also signed and ratified the Rome Statute. But the Kenyans, because they have done so, the third way the ICC can intervene is that the prosecutor can decide on his own to intervene. So these are 3 ways. Security Council, the country itself refers the case to the ICC, or the ICC prosecutor decides to intervene if the country has signed and ratified the Rome Statute, right? So those are the 3 ways the ICC has jurisdiction. The Security Council referral, that's only happened in 2 situations. Yes. Now to the political question about, and I think this is also touches on what Radwan was asking. I'm going to give you 2 answers. And this is the beautiful thing about leaving the ICC. I can tell you practical reality. How can the jurisdiction be expanded in the context of Sudan, given the current political realities? I don't think it's possible. I just don't think it's possible. You have a Security Council that is completely divided, and I see no path back. So the Russians have their head of state indicted by the International Criminal Court. The likelihood that they will allow anything that even smells like it supports an institution that has indicted their head of state is nil in my view. And they also have, a strong ally that also sits on the Security Council in the form of China, who will back them also because historically they have not wanted to see these types of multilateral institutions succeed. I think that's pretty clear. So even the idea that the Security Council could agree to just say that the ICC has jurisdiction over the current conflict, I think even that would be a form of endorsement that I don't see the Russians or the Chinese standing by. But this is my personal view. I can give you a theoretical answer. And theoretically, yes, either the Security Council could hear the force of the argument being made by the ICC prosecutor, being brought by civil society, being compelled to act in the interest of international peace and security. And in that context, either expanding or acknowledging that Resolution 1593 does include the current conflict, or issuing a new resolution authorizing the ICC to investigate not only in Darfur, but across Sudan. Theoretical possibility, practically impossible. Was there anything else? Oh, I think not, except that you guys missed an opportunity for me and Philip to fight publicly on this issue of reparations. Too bad, time's up.
Thank you so much, guys, for your answers. Thank you, everyone, for your really, really good questions. For those who weren't able to ask their questions, the two are still here. They'll be with us tomorrow as well. So there's ample opportunity to engage them one-on-one and also to engage them in the next session that we'll have tomorrow during the workshop. So with this, I'd like to close this panel. Thank you, everybody. And we close.